Hello friends, I'm here in Stockton Springs, Maine, USA, and today is going to be a little bit different of a story. I'm not at a cemetery, but I wanted to tell a story related to a video I previously posted. That video was about Elizabeth Haggerty Pynn, and if you recall, if you saw the video, I'll try to repost it in the comments, but it was a scene I came across when I was a little kid, about 11 years old, and she had died, been killed in a freak accident, and I did a deep dive, and that's how I started this business and ultimately this channel, was realizing I had some research skills, and I did a deep dive on her family and her husband. And so, having told Lizzie's story previously, I then wanted to do a story about her husband and his family because it kind of spans a couple centuries, and it's a cool story, I think. The reason that I'm at the ocean is because William Henry Pynn came from a long line of ancestors who were seafaring folk. They were sailors and fishermen, and I can't easily get to Newfoundland, so I figured I'd go to a local beach. It's still the Atlantic Ocean. Maine is kind of similar to Newfoundland in a lot of ways. Newfoundland is an island. Maine is sort of a peninsula. It's all on the Atlantic Ocean. My ancestors were fishermen, so I saw a lot of parallels in this story, and I figured this would be as close as I could get to a Newfoundland type landscape. But basically, the Pynns are one of the older families in Newfoundland. They all descend from the same line that Major General Sir Henry Pynn descended from. Henry Pynn was born 1769 in Mosquito, Newfoundland, which is now called Bristol's Hope. It was originally called Musket Town, and that evolved into Mosquito. And then around 1908, 1909, they then changed it permanently to Bristol's Hope. But Major General Sir Henry Pynn was born in Mosquito, Newfoundland in 1769. He eventually died in England in 1855, but he was the first Newfoundland-born citizen that was actually knighted. So Newfoundland was actually a protectorate of England, and so he was a British citizen, and he was the first Newfoundlander knighted. He actually fought the 1798 Irish Rebellion, and then later the Napoleonic Wars. So William Henry Pynn was not descended directly from Henry Pynn, but the same family line. To dig into William Henry Pynn's ancestry, first we'll look at his father. So Joseph Edward Pynn was born in Mosquito, Newfoundland in 1865. He was the son of Joseph Henry Pynn and Mary Ann Pynn. Joseph Edward Pynn married a Sarah Workman, who I suspect is actually Worthman, but I'll get to that in a minute. Not really sure exactly when he married her, but as far as I can tell, their oldest son was William Henry Pynn, who was born February 13th of 1889, and he was Lizzie's husband later. Now, the reason that I think Sarah Workman's real name might have been Sarah Worthman is Sarah Workman really wouldn't have been a common name in Newfoundland. The Workman family seems to be a British or Irish last name, and I can't find many other instances of Workmans. However, there are Worthmans aplenty. So I'm thinking that with the Newfoundland accent, it may have actually been Worthman. And there is no record that I can seem to find anywhere on Ancestry of Joseph Edward Pynn and Sarah Workman being married, but they obviously were, and their oldest child on record was William Henry Pynn. The next child to come along was James Pynn, and he was born 1890. Now, for about 60 years, one of the biggest exports from Newfoundland was iron ore, and there is an island in Newfoundland called Bell Island. So Bell Island was a major exporter of iron ore, and there were Bell Island mines. It was one of the largest employers in Newfoundland at that time. James actually worked in the Bell Island mines, and In 1919, a mine cart hit him, and he died shortly thereafter. His body was sent back to Mosquito for burial. He left a wife, Lucy, and one son named William, likely after his older brother. The next child to come along from Joseph Edward Pynn and Sarah Workman was John Charles Pynn. John Charles Pynn was born 1892, and he seems to be the longest surviving child in that family. We'll get back to William as he's the main star of this story, but just going down the family line, John Charles was his second brother to be born. 1892, he married Lillian Martin. They had a successful family, about 10 children. They lived in the nearby town of Harbor Grace. And from what I can tell, John Charles also worked in the mines, probably in Belle Island. But he lived the longest. He made it all the way till 1981. So he was about 88, 89 years old. Lived a long, full life. I couldn't find a obituary for him or a death record. However, he is on Find a Grave as dying in January of 1981 rather. The next children that were born to Joseph and Sarah Pynn, and Joseph, by the way, went by Edward in almost every document, but his legal name was Joseph Edward Pynn, so we'll call him Edward going forward. They had twin girls born in 1893. There was Anne and Amanda May. Anne only survived 1 month before she passed away. Amanda May actually lived 2 years and 5 months and died of scarlatina or scarlet fever in March of 1896. They had another daughter that was born 1895 in August named Elizabeth Ann Pynn, and she actually died of consumption or tuberculosis the same month that her sister Amanda May Pynn passed away, the other twin, 1896. So Edward and Sarah lost 2 daughters in March of 1896. It may have both been consumption or tuberculosis, as it was super common at that time, but they did mark Amanda May's death as scarlet fever and Elizabeth Ann's as tuberculosis or consumption, as they called it. The next child that was born was Francis, who was a male. There really is very little information on Francis. Francis was born 1897, and I know that because I have a contact that actually went to the rooms in St. John's, Newfoundland, which is the capital of Newfoundland, and a lot of archives are there that are not online. And there was a record of Francis being born in 1897. Francis, of course, being a male or female name, this was a boy. And there's no record that I can find anyway, or my contact could find, of Francis's death or what happened to him after 1897. The next child born was Joseph Henry Pynn, named after his grandfather, and he was born 1898 in February 13th, actually, the same day as his older brother William Henry Pynn, except 11 years apart. Or 9 years apart, rather. Now, Joseph Henry lived a long, full life as well. He lived from 1898 to 1976. He lived on Belle Island. He actually was a World War I veteran who had previously injured his hand in a shooting accident before the war. And when he injured his hand, it was withered, and so he was given a honorable discharge. I couldn't find a birth record of him. I think my contact did say there was one at the rooms in St. John's, but we also know that he was Joseph Edward Pynn and Sarah Pynn's son because he references them in his military paperwork. Joseph Henry Pynn married a girl from Massachusetts, actually, Julia Peddle. And they had about 10 children as well. They lived on Belle Island, and they actually had a store on Belle Island. Joseph Henry living on Belle Island, logically, he could have worked in the mines, but he probably didn't because of his withered hand. Some of his brothers did, however. We already talked about James, who died in the minecart accident. There were a few other brothers we'll get to in a moment. But Joseph lived a long, full life as well. He was about 78 years old when he passed away, died in a hospital. And he was feisty from all accounts. I've talked to some of his descendants, and he was a good man, but a very tough, knew how to survive. He'd been through a lot. Obviously a World War I veteran. We'll get to what happened to his father in a moment, but Joseph was a survivor for sure. He actually warned about the Nazis. He was out fishing, and he and his wife saw a submarine in the harbor by Belle Island, and sure enough, the next day the Nazis actually torpedoed Belle Island. So we don't think of the Nazis as attacking North America, but they actually did. They attacked Newfoundland, and he had tried to warn the authorities beforehand, and they sort of laughed him off. They didn't take him seriously, and he swore never to go to the authorities about anything again. Another story that I came across for Joseph was somebody had thrown a rock through his window, and it broke his bathroom window and landed in the bathtub. He refused to move the rock until the Canadian Mounties had come to look at it. Of course, Newfoundland became part of Canada in 1949, so he seemed like he was quite a character. The next Pynn child to be born to Edward and Sarah was Frank. Frank was born the following year in 1899. Frank was actually a World War I veteran as well, technically. By technically, I mean he was in the Royal Newfoundland Regiment, but he was actually dishonorably discharged for drunkenness. He was a sailor. The Pynns basically went wherever they could find work, so Frank had sailed all across the world. He had worked whatever jobs after that he could find, and finally he found himself in Pennsylvania working for a farmer that ran a sawmill. Frank was working on the sawmill in 1935, and a piece of wood became lodged in the sawmill. Upon trying to dislodge the wood, it shot right through his nose into his brain and killed him instantly. Frank is buried in an unmarked grave in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. He did marry a woman a few years before that. She was about 12 years older than him, if I remember right. She was a divorcee. She was in her 40s. He was in his 30s at the time. The next Pynn child on record, only in the rooms in St. John's, again, I found out from my contact, there's no history online except what I've added on Family Search, is Mary Ann Pynn, likely named after her grandfather, Edward's mother. She was born 1901. I have no idea what would have happened to her after that. I don't know if she survived. I think she did, and I'll say why in a minute when we talk about her father's death, but I can't find any other record other than what my contact told me about Mary Ann, born 1901. The next Pynn child born was Herbert. Herbert was born in 1903, and he died 1959 of stomach cancer. He actually worked in the Belle Island mines and was cited in one of their monthly newsletters for perfect attendance at work. But he was only about 56 when he passed away of stomach cancer or carcinoma. Herbert was a longtime miner in the Belle Island mines. The last Pynn child born that I could find would be Edward, named obviously after his father. Edward was born 1905. He too lived on Belle Island with his wife Jessie, and Edward lived to 1978. Edward is also buried on Belle Island. He was a miner for a long time as well. So there's the history of the Pynn family. Now getting back to Joseph Edward Pynn, or Edward as we call him. Edward was a fisherman just like his father was and his ancestors were. And one day in 1908, he was coming back from his day out fishing. He went to the nearby town of Carbonear to sell his fish, and suddenly he had massive pain in his side. So he was taken back to Mosquito. He couldn't walk. He couldn't use whatever transportation he had brought. Somebody had to bring him back. So they brought him back home and called for the doctor. As the doctor walked into the house, he passed away of peritonitis, which is inflammation of the covering that covers your internal organs. So Joseph was only about 42, 43, Joseph Edward, when he passed away. And back then, there wasn't really obituaries per se that I could find for Newfoundlanders. It was more a blurb in the newspaper, in the Harbor Grace Standard, and a few other papers. And it stated that he had passed away tragically, left many friends and family members, and he left a wife and 9 children. So if we do the math, we know that the twins had died and their sister Elizabeth Ann had died. And if we add them up, we would get about 9 children, 12 total, 3 passed away at that point. So even the ones where I can't find record after their birth, they may have still been alive. I find it interesting that they had both a Francis and a Frank, both males. So usually you wouldn't name one Frank and one Francis, but it's a possibility as well. Or maybe one had the middle name, or maybe they had other children that weren't even on record. They had a ton of children back then because they knew the infant mortality rate was so high, and justifiably so. We saw how many just in this family passed away. But a little bit more about William. It appears that he first crossed over the border into the United States around 1914. So he would have been roughly 25 years old or so. Before that, he probably worked odd jobs in Newfoundland, probably helped support his mother. His mother did remarry. So Sarah Workman or Worthman Pynn did remarry a wealthy farmer in Mosquito, by then Bristol's Hope, named Thomas Butler. Thomas had many children, and he'd been married at least 4 or 5 times. So back then, a lot of times they would remarry so somebody could take care of the children while the husband worked. And there's no record of Sarah's marriage to Thomas Butler, just like there seems to be no record of her marriage to Joseph Edward Pynn. Back then, records are pretty scarce, especially on a small island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. So I got together what I could, but nowhere can I seem to find a wedding record for Sarah. We only know she married Thomas Butler because of, again, Joseph Henry Pynn, her son's military records, where he lists her living in Bristol's Hope, then married to a Thomas Butler. So at some point, she did marry him. There is a record of a Sarah Butler dying of liver failure, essentially, in July of 1919. So I believe that's her. Bristol's Hope, the same area. It has her at 55 years old, which would put her born 1864, 1 year before Joseph Edward Pynn was born. So I do believe that that is the Sarah, although I can't prove it for sure. That seems the most logical explanation for it. And she died of jaundice, which is essentially you turn yellow because of liver issues. So I don't know if she was a drinker at that point or anything like that, or if it was just a natural liver failure, but that was the cause of death listed. She's listed as being born in Harbor Grace, or buried in Harbor Grace rather. Not much other information is available. It does have her listed as Catholic. Thomas Butler was Catholic. Joseph Pynn, her first husband, was Protestant, Church of England. But of course, back then, the wife would usually identify with whatever religion her husband was. So she may have very well converted to Catholicism. Getting back to William Henry Pynn, there is a crossing record of him crossing the United States in 1914 to Eastport, Maine. And I told much of this story in the Lizzie video, but basically William married Lizzie in 1917. He was almost immediately drafted into World War I. He served as a coastal gunner in Cape Elizabeth, Maine. And for the longest time, they had 4 children who all died in infancy of various stomach ailments. And William and Lizzie can be found after the war in the 1920 census living in Holton, Maine with her family. And after that, most of this is in Lizzie's video, but Lizzie was arrested for lewd and lascivious behavior in 1923. She spent a year or so in the Skowhegan Women's Reformatory before she was actually put in a sanitarium. And I couldn't find what happened to William after that, but finally I did visit the state archives, and William died in a Lewiston, Maine hospital, St. Mary's Hospital, March 19 of 1926 of liver cancer. And he's buried in the Pauper Cemetery, or also known as Potter's Field, in Lewiston, Maine. If I ever get a chance to go to Lewiston, I'll definitely make a video of that. But William lived a short life. He was only about, let's see, he died in 1926. He was about 37 years old when he passed away. On almost every record, his name is misspelt: Pinn, Penn. It's supposed to be Pynn. That's his actual name. His date of birth was usually wrong. Even on the Lewiston burial records, it has him as being 27 years old versus the actual 37 he was. But it's definitely the person. So very interesting history there.